I was raised in a very conservative family with parents who had very clear values. And there were two values. They wanted hard work, and they wanted to reward achievement. So if we didn't do our homework or we didn't actually do our chores, we heard about it. But if we achieved something, we got a little certificate from school or perhaps a ribbon, it would go on the refrigerator. And the refrigerator actually did not become about food, it became about accomplishment, right? So it was with some mirth and humor that my sister told me when I was named the CEO of Sulaki 9 months ago that in fact, sure enough, Mom had actually taken the article about me becoming CEO and put it on the refrigerator, right? So imagine my concern when 9 months later we had a little bit of press about inappropriate content on the Habbo site. And after we got through the initial storm, I said, well, I better call Mom because I don't want Mom to hear about it from the broadcast media. I'd rather she hear it from me. So I called Mom in the evening and I said, Mom, how you doing? She said, fine. I said, well, have you heard some of the news? She said, yeah, and it's been really hard. And I said, oh, I was mortified. And I said, well, why has it been hard? She said, well, our kitchen's not that big, and with all this news, we had to get a second refrigerator. So the reason I tell the story is at least Mom stood by when things got a little choppy, because when it comes to child safety and the broadcast media, no one else will, okay? So we're in an industry that is vulnerable, and it's vulnerable. I'm going to talk today about its vulnerability, because it's vulnerable because we do not stand together. And that's going to be the one thing I want you to take away from this. And if we take anything away from the Habbo mute, it's about how we as an industry were not mature enough to handle sensitive issues as a group. We all stand alone in this, and that is our vulnerability. So I'm going to tell some stories. I'm going to give an offer to everyone here, and then I'm going to make actually a bit of a challenge, right? The stories are going to be self-evident. The offer is going to be that from this point forward, none of you need stand alone if you're in the business of offering content to teens, because we'll make our lessons learned available to you. Because we think the entire industry has to move forward, and we don't stand alone. We need to move forward together, and we need to make safety a non-negotiable given, not something that we compete on. Okay, so that's the one message for today, and that's my offer. So let's go ahead and go through a little bit. This is why we are vulnerable, because no one can actually answer this question when it comes to teens and children. Right? When are you meeting the standard? Not so much what is the standard, but when do you meet it? Okay? So if you think that you have content that you can stay off the radar, well, that's kind of a logical fallacy, because you want to be on the radar because you want to get big enough to actually have a large business. So you are going to come on the radar eventually. Second thing is, well, I'll hide behind my social network. Facebook will handle it, or whoever, like Tencent, et cetera, whoever will handle it. Well, if you go back to the standing alone theory, if you have a problem in your game and you're on a social network, trust me, you will be jettisoned, right? If you even look at some of the issues around the App Store and the way things were handled when there was inappropriate contact, it did not go upstream, it goes downstream. So everyone here is in the business of safety. You cannot hide from it, nor should you, right? So here's how we did it. The last 8 years at Habbo, we would actually partner with and go to government agencies and have them certify us. We would invite inspectors in to have a look, and in fact, in September of 11, we had the EU Safety by Design Award. They came in, they looked at our systems up and down, and they actually said, you get an award. You have designed a system that is as safe as possible and mitigates issues. Okay? So we thought that was good enough. However, June of 12, we were gleefully drugged through the media as a, quote, a toxic brand. Where were those agencies who gave us the awards? Nowhere to be found. So there literally is no way you can actually certify yourself nor prepare yourself for what can happen in the broadcast media other than by engaging your community and making it as safe as possible, and by us standing together, okay? So, the obvious logic when you look at that is, well, if you got an award in September, and you had an issue in June, something must have changed. Well, something did. In February, we reorganized the company. And when we reorganized the company, we actually increased the headcount on safety and user care. We increased the spend on safety and user care. And we actually increased the number of product people building products for safety and user care. Because my theory was that happy Habos, having a 5-star experience, are going to stay longer and increase retention. And of course, safety is a part of that. A happy Habo has to know that they are safe, and their parents have to know that they are safe. And so we called it actually the 5-star Habo program. And if you go back to the Twitter feeds, you go back to the blog posts, you can see a persistent program of improving on user care and customer safety. So something doesn't make sense. Well, pay attention. This is the industry that you're in, right? It doesn't make sense at this point. Okay, let's go to the beginning and just call it right out. A reporter in the UK went on the site, found inappropriate chat, and it was inappropriate and unacceptable for the site. No question. She engaged in that chat, and she reported on it. Those are the facts. What was also reported needs a little bit of clarification. So, when the group of 250 million users are being bombarded with this type of chat, that is not correct. 250 million users is the number of users over the life of Habo. The number of concurrent users at any one time is much lower than that, and we're very clear that it's 6 million a month. So these numbers were all being connected incorrectly and thrown around, okay? So the underlying denominator in the number of people who are using Habo was misreported. Second thing, when this was reported, we were clearly concerned. We actually stopped the site from being able to communicate. We did a forensic investigation, and we went in to make sure that we understood what was happening. And what we did was, we took algorithmic search software, and we keep all the chat logs. So anything that is said in Habo, we have on record. And we went back and looked at all the chat logs during that period of time, because we wanted to know the scope of the problem, because we really wanted to address it. Here's what we found. In fact, 3.7% of Habos were engaging in inappropriate chat. That's the fact. Now, I'm not going to make a single value judgment about that number, because I would imagine if I went around the room here and asked each of you, is 3.7 high or is 3.7 low, there would not be a single corroborating answer here. There would be massive disagreement on that. And this is why our industry is vulnerable, because no one can actually say when you've achieved the right standard or what you've achieved a safe level of inappropriateness in a site. No one can say. Some will bang their shoe on the table and say 0, and some will say, nah. It's completely up in the air right now, and that's why we're vulnerable. We can't actually say what is the right amount, okay? Impact. So I think in the news you all read it, but I'll just walk through kind of the sequence of events that went from the initial report all the way up to the site being muted, because it's interesting how things begin to fall, and you all could find yourself in the same situation. The reporter sent us a note, in accordance with just basically saying this report is coming out. The investors got a hold of the note, and it began a series of actions inside the company, and off it went. Bloggers were given portions of the report, and they actually took and made the leap to make it worse. So they actually went from inappropriate chat on the site to making it a pedophile issue. Then the owners saw that, and they were in the same market as where this reporting went, and the issue just got larger and larger and larger until investors began to leave. The first investor left before the report even aired, right? That's the power of impending doom that can come across the minds of people who are sitting astride this thing, okay? When it finally did hit, the investors, the remaining investors, as you can imagine, were in a very difficult state. And they said, we should shut the site down. And we actually had to think about it. We said, our first thing is to protect the users. So we're not going to shut the site down. We're going to mute it so we can do a proper investigation. And if the result of that investigation is the site needs to be shut down, so be it. But let's do the investigation to at least know what we're talking about and not make decisions that are not thoughtful. So in the end, we muted the site. We'd essentially, in a period of 48 hours, put a teen population the size of Greece in timeout, right? And it was just a series of actions that just resulted in a domino to that point, right? Then something really interesting happened. In response to the broadcast media's allegations, the community stood up. And they actually started holding candlelight vigils, and even though they couldn't talk, there were thousands of them that bought candles and would just sit in the site with their candles burning. And it was amazing. We had staff members just absolutely stunned and in tears. They'd been working on the product for 6 years, and to see this coming together of the community was very touching. My reaction immediately was, uh-oh, because that sort of solidarity isn't going to immediately need to be addressed, or it begins to become ugly, it becomes a mob, right? So that's when we came up with the Great Unmute. And the Great Unmute was, while we were doing the forensic analysis and the proper restoration of the service through careful consideration and pragmatic restoration of bits of the service, we had to give them voice. And so what we did was, we said, come on the site and tell us what Habbo means to you. We're going to give you an 8-hour period to talk about what Habbo means, and it was going to be pre-moderated, meaning that we were only going to let content up after it had been screened and filtered. This was a huge gamble, because we made the agreement without knowing what was going to happen that we would only filter for obscenity and spam and inappropriate content, but that critical comments as well as positive comments would be allowed on the site. And in fact, the site is still live. And if you look at the Great Unmute, you can see there's quite a bit of critical content on there as well. In 6 hours, 13,000 posts were made. And you can see there the breakdown by country. They're thoughtful posts from users who expressed what the site meant to them, okay? And the most interesting thing is that it's all very personal. And what came out of it was friendship, games, and free expression is what they valued about Habbo. So from one report that had a couple extra blog posts in the UK, we had 13,000 responses. Broadcast media had issued the challenge. Social media actually gave the response. And what happened for the investors was they looked at this in the press, and the investors began to see that the power of the community was what mattered. The reputation of the site came from the community, and in fact, the remaining investors stood strong. So it can be said about the Habbo Mute that it was not some enterprising staff members that saved Habbo. It was not actually investors that saved Habbo, certainly not. It was the community literally saved itself. It stood up and said, this is what we're about. There also were 1,000 videos, by the way, very articulate in the most part, and surprisingly cogent and incisive in their analysis of the situation. So here's my Twitter feed, and so basically we did the Great Unmute, and for a moment we thought, well, this is great. We got a great response, and it immediately changed the tone of the conversation globally. But then I'd like to think I'm always fearful one step ahead, so I said, well, this Mute certainly was going to allow a bit of the steam to blow off, but then they're going to want more, and sure enough, this is my Twitter feed, actually. I tweet with the users pretty much every day. And here's what we call the stages of a Habbo's patience, right? So at first they came back and they just said, enough already, we've had it. This Mute is unacceptable, we can't have any more of this, right? And then became the ad hominem stage, right, which is you and your staff are stupid, and all variants of that, sometimes with words that are a little harsher. And then as we begin to restore service, which we have with a whitelist chat in some markets, it then became about equality, right? So then it came back to, well, why are you unmuting them and not us? And so it became a bit of an internal struggle. And finally, when they were unmuted and they were able to talk to their friends, it was, oh, thanks so much, right? Just great, thanks a lot, right? So that's the stages of anger for a Habbo who's been muted. So social psychologists certainly can use that data. So at this point now, 85% of the site is back online with, all of the site is back online with whitelist chat, meaning they can use a certain amount of approved words, and 85% is on with a filtered chat, meaning they can talk what they want, but there's certain words and phrases and combinations they cannot use. So the majority of the site is actually restored, and in fact, the traffic level is back to 85% of what it was before the mute. So they came back. So our industry, let's make it about us again, our industry. So I want to use an analogy of the airline industry, because that is an industry that has a clear record and statement around standards and safety. And I think it's actually a useful analogy to think about. So we all know the very simple fact that it's safer to fly in a plane than drive in your car. And so we all accept that statistically being true, and actually the spirit of the industry is to make that true. You get on the airline, they say for your comfort and safety. Safety is very much a part of the entire industry. So if you're on airline A or B, they say the same thing. What the industry competes on is leg room and price and all sorts of amenities. You know, I get my cup of cookies or whatever. They never, ever compete on safety. So now let's transport ourselves to a strange alternate universe just for one moment. And let's picture that airline A has a plane kind of splash into the Potomac. Everyone's okay, so it's not a terrible tragedy, but it's concerning that a plane goes into the river, okay? And you look on that and you see the report, plane from airline A goes in the river, and then you immediately see a commercial from airline B saying, you won't splash in the river if you fly airline B. It'd be kind of weird, right? Then you see another ad. Hey, we're Pratt & Whitney engines. Use our engines. Airline A didn't use it. They went in the river, right? The vendor's jumping on board. Then you see a news report that night, and the safety leader from airline C gets on there and says, they're a bunch of, they're no good anyway. They don't use the proper wing nuts. They're flying death traps over there at A, right? If you heard that about the airline industry, you would immediately feel, I would feel that is like the whole industry is completely out of sorts, and the whole thing is unsafe. I don't care if you're A, B, or C, because when B has a problem, A is going to do the same thing. It makes the whole industry look bad if in that fanciful world that happened. That is precisely what happened when the news came out about this. Competitors, vendors, and others all started jumping on board, positioning against each other. And that is foolish. Because all it does is makes us all look unsafe. So the challenge for all of us is how do we adopt the airline standard without having a government agency like the FAA or the Transportation Authority in Europe or whatever? How do we do what the airline industry does and come together and actually make it so that we're safe, right? So what we did was a similar accident kind of protocol, and we suggest that we all adopt it. You stop, you investigate, and you share the lessons, and that's what we're here to do. Okay, so what did we do in terms of lesson number one? Habos, we knew we had this problem of 3.7% on the site, and we had a majority that were actually silent, and we thought that this vocal minority was too vocal. So we went and used a little counterinsurgency theory, because ultimately teens are insurgents. They always want to push the boundaries, right? And in counterinsurgency theory, it says, disorder, which is the normal state of nature, is cheap to create and expensive to stop. You could find no better statement about moderating content than that. And so what we did is we created a Habo awakening, and what I did is we offered a Habo patrol. Because what we wanted to do is we wanted to activate the minority that cared about the site, that was on the great unmute, and have them begin to actively police the site. Because it was the collaboration with the community that was going to make the big change. And in fact, what we found follows precisely with counterinsurgency theory. 8% volunteered to help, 3.7% were behaving inappropriately, and 88.3% are the neutral majority that were just going along for the ride. Immediately, the site changed in terms of its dynamic. In fact, there was, we were getting these reports from the patrol. A group of 20 raided patrol members came in, and we stopped it. They got this real excitement about actually getting in there and really sorting the site out, right? If I had 3 regiments of such people, we could win this war in a month, right? So the lessons learned are basically the decisions as these things happen or emerge organically. So if you have a binder somewhere that says this is what you do in case of this and that, that's completely irrelevant. You have to be completely in touch with your community, engage with them, and like we went from the mute to the unmute to the whitelist to the more filtered chat, we organically made our decisions based on what was right for the community. You have to operate that way. Secondly, the communities need leadership. You can't just launch products into groups of teens or children and just say, okay, there you go, guys. You have to get in there and lead them and tell them what is right and what is wrong. And we do that through a process we call the Habo Way, which is a statement of principles about what is allowed and what is not. Finally, a little counterinsurgency theory, you have to live amongst them. If your employees are not on the site, then you don't know what's going on. You have to be in the site itself to see what's going on. And finally, it's the lesson for all of us here is Safety is a collaborative venture of this industry, and we have to move forward together. We cannot compete on safety. Let's compete on the fun. You make a game that's more fun, you make a game that's more engaging, fantastic. We high five out there, but we all collaborate on safety. If we don't do that, we'll never get anywhere. Finally, where Habbo goes, just a couple quick points. Habbo is a quirky, tongue-in-cheek, irreverent teen community, right? And we are managing it that way. It is not a product, it is not a group of apps, it is a community that we give access to partners and give access to others. It is a living, breathing civic community, and that's how we view it. Likewise, we're going to take our lessons learned of activating the small minority who want to work on the site and systematize it in things we call guardians, which is actually an achieved level of expertise in the service, and therefore that Habbo Patrol instinct to protect can actually be achieved in the service and move forward. And finally, idle hands are bad work, we'll just say. We're going to continue the work we started late last year of making Habbo a platform that allows third parties to have access to this community. And within a week, we're actually launching our first third-party game with a UK developer, Remote. I love Remote sitting here. And they have done a capital job of creating a really deep, rich game that uses the Habbo fiction somewhat, but it's just great game mechanic, and you get out there, and we actually are launching this within the week. We're launching this within the week because we've been working on this for months, right? So the Mute was actually just one event in a long development process for us moving forward. So there's some stories. I give you my offer that if you're in the business and you want the lessons learned, we'll make them available to you. And finally, I'm just make the pleasant challenge that if we don't come together and create a collaborative version of the airline industry where there's no silver bullet solution, but we're all working on a nuanced solution to make safety non-negotiable and something we all collaborate on together and not something we compete on. We need to do that in order to have this to be a vibrant industry, and then we'll compete on the fun. So if we do that together, then we stand in good stead to grow this industry and be a trusted part of it, because like the airlines say, riding in a plane is better than riding in a car, we collectively want people to say, you know, when you let your teen or your child into a moderated site, it's safer than a place that's not moderated. Statistically true, and actually spiritually true. That's the key. We have to do it, or we just won't actually have this industry grow. Thanks very much. I think we'll open it up to a few questions.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So questions, and we've got a mic. If you would make sure to get that first. One, hot topics.
Great. It's solved. It's solved. Yeah.
Hello.
Hey.
To what extent did the different languages that people use in Habbo prevent a problem when you were trying to solve this issue?
We actually operate in 8 different languages organically, and so the language itself was not the issue. We were able to actually, for example, implement whitelist chat in 8 languages fairly quickly because we have native speakers in all those languages. So if you're going to operate in multiple jurisdictions, then you have to have that. What I will say, though, is the expectations culturally around what is acceptable and what is not is very different in each country. So if you go to Denmark versus Brazil, you're going to have different expectations of what that 3.7% means. And that's where you have to actually fine-tune your system. Go ahead, I'll repeat the question. Yeah.
Hello.
You're fine.
Basically, you said you're opening up the Habbo community for other developers. Can you be a bit more elaborate on what you're actually opening up? Is it the user base, or for developers to build things inside Habbo world?
We've opened an API where developers can actually, so the remote game actually sits in its own environment, but it is contiguous with the Habbo experience. So it's similar to other social networks where you can go from in that network to a gaming experience. We're not, we allow freedom around art style and different fiction because the teens' minds are facile enough they can understand that. So.
It's on.
Hello. Oh, it is on. So can you elaborate a little more? You're proposing a model like the airline industry. It could be an independent organization, say, that gets together and does guidelines, or it could be a bunch of companies partnering together to meet on a monthly, bi-monthly basis. Do you have more ideas specifically for what you want that community of people to be? And do you think there are other models, say from education, that could be interesting to look into when you're establishing your guidelines?
Absolutely. At a minimum, we need to have an informal working group of companies that rely on child and teen safety to come together and to say, this is a common standard of practice. So if something is discovered to be wrong, we stop, we evaluate, we share the lessons, this kind of framework. And I think that is actually a very low-cost way that we can move quickly. What happens is there are a disparate number of government and child safety initiatives that are interested in how to do this because they're as curious about setting standards and having this work as anything. So we're actually a member of the CEO Coalition in Europe, where I'm actually going to go and participate in a round table on specifically these lessons learned for companies in Europe to ensure that we actually do this. But I think as an industry, we can do this informally to start, and then I'm just suggesting that at a very low level, we could then maybe all put a little bit of money in to formalize it, so that this becomes a way that if there is a problem, it becomes about a tactical incident versus some sort of systemic problem, because the whole industry needs to come together so that the broadcast media then is not then picking off individuals, which is very easy to do in terms of how we've organized it. So, those would be my thoughts.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.